Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural edition of the Honors Philosophy podcast. Our first guest is none other than our very own Rabbi Sonenberg. What we're going to do on this podcast is we're going to discuss different issues that we're exploring in class together, and take the opportunity to bring in new people, fresh faces, and fresh ideas to enlighten our conversation and to enrich our discussion in class. So Rabbi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things we try and do in our class is to not just have our conversations about philosophy and Jewish philosophy in the abstract, but to really make them personal conversations. And probably no unit is this more critical and appropriate for than our unit on metaphysics. So we're recording this now over Sukkot break. Our students have already gotten a basic introduction to philosophy. We did our introduction to logic and to epistemology. And we started on the Jewish philosophy end, talking about the first midrash in Parshat Lech Lecha, where the midrash offers the parable of the illuminated palace, right? Where the backstory to Avram being encountered by God at the beginning of Parshat Lech Lecha is this process of discovery. And we looked at two interpretations of that midrash, the interpretation of Rambam, which is rooted in the Rambam's rationalist faith, and the idea that Avram discovered God through his powers of deduction and his powers of reason. And we discussed that dovetails with the Rambam's position that Anochi Hashem Elokecha is in fact a commandment. And alternatively, we looked at the position of Chazdai Kreskas and Or Hashem that looks at the Medrash slightly differently and sees Avram's faith as deriving from his prophetic experience, that he wasn't fully without doubt until he had some encounter, some experience of faith that really solidified it for us. And we set this up as a sort of paradigm for two ways of looking at faith. Faith is something that's rationally defensible, something that can be proven, right? Or faith is something that has to derive from experience, something that in fact can't be proven. And so that's really going to be the focus of our discussion today. But because we like to focus on the personal, the first question I want to ask you is, can you just share a little bit about your faith journey? Meaning, what does your life look like, really from childhood till today, from the perspective of faith? How have you evolved? How have your positions and perspectives changed over time in terms of your core emunah, what animates and drives you as a believing Jew?
Okay. So interesting. I grew up in a conservative household. I would say stark conservative. In other words, that we, went to shul every week, Shabbos, the whole deal, kosher in the home. But definitely in terms of religious background, not very solid. I mean, it was understood, an understood belief, an understood, experience of religion, but certainly never really explored or talked about. And in terms of my exploration, in terms of my religious experience, in terms of, connecting to orthodoxy or the orthodox theological approach, it's pretty much just learning. In other words, I was never one of the people who kind of got connected to religion through singing and sholem and stuff like that. I was more the person who got connected to it based upon learning. In other words, the intellectual approach is definitely something that resonated with me. In terms of my first, religious philosophical exposure is definitely Rambam anchored. In terms of my reading, in terms of my relationship to that, and then that's how I got started with the religious approach, and kind of from there I've kind of branched into the Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Berkovitz sort of exposure and getting a more modern, intellectual perspective on religious thought. So that's kind of roughly where I'm at.
Was there a moment for you, and I'm not looking for dramatic, moments, but was there sort of a time period of your life where you really felt like your perspective solidified in terms of this is what I believe in? And could you share a little bit of what, if there's an elevator pitch to your belief, what does that sort of look like?
I don't know if I would say there's ever a moment in terms of where my belief solidifies, and I don't know if I actually believe in solidified belief. I think that it's a continual process. I don't think that the way that I perceive things today will be the way that I perceive things next year. Certainly not the way that I perceived it last year. I don't think it's a good idea to be kind of like rigid in terms of your thinking. And the more that you kind of like develop a greater understanding of ideas, and your faith can become more nuanced and I think more sophisticated. So I wouldn't say that there's ever a point in my life that I can say, now I got it. I never get it. I think it's always a work in progress.
Okay, so that brings us to really our core question for today, which is, do you think we can prove that God exists? Is God a rational concept that can be proven?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm asked it a lot. I say yes, and I also say no, in that I don't think anything can be proven in terms of like the epistemological approach. I don't know that there's very much that I can prove. But in terms of whatever I determine as necessary to know in order to act, then I think that I can prove it. In other words, I can't prove anything, but I still act my life as if I know things. I mean, but when it comes to God, I think that we can get enough of a sense of the truth of God's existence to act with that knowledge. But I don't believe that you can define it. Like, I can't prove it to somebody 100%. I think that there's always a way to argue against it. I think that if I came across an atheist, I don't think I could, I don't believe in the idea that I could go ahead and tell somebody some magical argument and all of a sudden the person would say, oh, I never thought about that. And then they'd be an automatic believer. I don't think that that's a reality either. I believe that would undermine freedom of choice in terms of religious choice, which would make it kind of pointless. And then pretty much just people who are intellectual would be forced to be religious. I don't think that's a reality either. So I think there's always an intellectual argument. You can always argue your way out of it. I think there's always angles to look at it. But I think that a person can be honest and intellectual and accept God as real.
So let me unpack that for a second before we sort of get into your feelings about what the proof might look like and what it might be. So I'm observing a sort of a distinction in your mind between the idea of proving anything, right, at all, meaning being able to say anything with absolute certainty, and then the provability of God. And it sounds like you would say God is somewhat as provable as anything else that I feel like I know and I feel certain of. So I want to drill down on that and just, let's use some comparisons, right? Like if I asked you to prove that the couch you're sitting on exists, is the proof of God the same to you? Are you employing essentially the same epistemological reasoning to achieve that? Or do those two questions, does the couch exist versus does God exist, are they fundamentally different? Is one more provable than the other?
So imagine, I would say for the couch example, so imagine I'm standing up in front of the couch and I'm not looking at the couch. I have my eyes closed, I can't see the couch. And now I have a decision to make. Should I sit down? Now, if the couch is there, it's going to go wonderfully. If the couch is not there, it's not going to go well at all. Right? But nonetheless, I choose to sit down because I know the couch is there. I mean, and you can do that. I mean, without the couch, you can do it with a chair, but I mean, hopefully your students have this experience when you're in younger grades, the kid would pull the chair from under you as you tried to sit down and the chair's not there anymore. Right? But you trust that the chair's there and you sit down and the chair catches you. And it's a safe decision to make. You're making that decision. So, I mean, in terms of understanding that the couch is there, it's based upon my experience, I guess, that, I mean, it's been there every other time. It's been there the last time I looked and it's still good. So again, in terms of my experience that God exists, or that my experience or my relationship to God is the same as it was yesterday. So then when I act upon that, I feel like it's the same decision for me.
I mean, but doesn't that isn't the piece about closing your eyes, isn't that important in this? Because you have the choice to open your eyes and see the couch or close your eyes and not see the couch. And I understand when your eyes are closed, you're acting on trust or on faith. But you do have that ability to open your eyes and give yourself a certain amount more assurance. Whereas when it comes to God, you don't necessarily have that same ability to open your eyes, just sticking with this analogy.
Right, for sure. I mean, the reason why I chose closing your eyes is because people always get upset about God not being physical. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, I can't see him, I can't point to him, I can't touch him. And therefore that seems to undermine the reality or the truth of his existence. But I mean, we can trust that things exist even when we don't physically see them or feel them or touch them. That was the mashal I was giving. And certainly, I mean, we trust our senses more than we trust our minds. But on some level, the reality is that our senses pretty much are our minds. And it's a bit of a, I mean, like in terms of the again the epistemological approach and understanding that, I mean, what I feel with my hand is really not necessarily any more real than it's all happening in my brain anyways. I mean, the whole idea of what I think and what I see, again, we rely on our senses and we give them a lot more credit than I think is actually deserved. I don't know that our senses are as trustworthy as we actually give them credit for. And we don't realize that what my sense is perceiving is really just my mind doing the same thing. So sense perception, I believe, is also an intellectual endeavor. In other words, it's just my mind interpreting things. So whether I'm interpreting physical signals or whether it's ideas and thoughts, I think it's the same organ that's doing the understanding.
Okay, so let's get to it. So what would a proof of God look like to you?
Proof of God. So in terms of, I mean, the proof of God that I generally work with is more in lines with the Kuzari. In other words, the proof of God, I mean, from, I guess, first cause or for argument of design, those are very lovely. In terms of compelling, even if you convince me on them, they don't really work for me. And that, like, all that gets me is a creator. It doesn't get me a relationship with a creator. It doesn't get me a creator that commands me to anything. If I don't have Matan Torah, I'm not a religious Jew. At best, I'm a philosopher who's not an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But so I'm saying, so from my perspective, if I can't get a God that has communicated with human beings, then on some level, again, I don't really have very much in terms of what to go on. So I would say that the framework in terms of my experience is the relational experience in terms of Matan Torah as that pivotal moment of the revelation of God to man. So that's where I would form my personal experience.
Okay, what does that look like to you? Meaning, I'm you're in the Kuzari's court, right? And you're being asked to offer your proof. What does that proof look like?
So, I mean, so the proof, I mean, from my perspective, it does rely on the other arguments. In other words, because the proof is on some level a dichotomy, saying, well, either man wrote the Torah or God wrote the Torah. I mean, some human being made it up and claimed that God wrote it, or God gave it to Moshe and then Moshe wrote it down, sort of thing. In other words, either somebody made a claim or it's actually as it's said. In order to be as it's said, I need to have a God. Otherwise, I mean, I could say, man wrote it or a unicorn wrote it, and that doesn't really get me very far because I don't have.
Sorry to interrupt. So what you're saying there is you're not immune to the first cause argument.
I need the first cause argument to give me some plausible other alternative to the authorship of the Torah. In other words, if I don't have a first cause, then I don't know. Then it's either man or, well, if I don't have any other option, then I guess I'm going to go as remotely unlikely that it is a man that made up such a story and got it passed off and bought by a mass nation. But if I don't have anybody else, if there's no other options, then I guess that must be it. But again, if God is a viable option, right? If I need to have God as a viable option. In other words, so I do need either a first cause or an argument of design as a possibility. Not necessarily is going to prove that God exists, but I mean, it certainly has to be a reasonable possibility. And then that relative to the possibility that man wrote the Torah. And then I would kind of like weigh the odds of the two and choose.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we got God as our first cause. And we're familiar with that argument, right? That ultimately, unless you're going to go into a set of infinite regressives, you have to have some sort of first cause that's responsible for everything, and that in essence is somewhat beyond human understanding, right? And this was obviously very influential in the Rambam's argument for God. But talk a little bit about Matan Torah and how you see Matan Torah as playing a key rationalistic piece in defending not just God, but God as he communicates with Moshe, and then in turn the God of the Jewish people and Jewish tradition and all of that stuff.
I mean, you're talking like in terms of like develop the idea of true report, like Rav Sajago and that sort of.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. Again, we're back in this. You're in the court, right? You're proving that God exists. You're proving that Matan Torah can be defended rationally. It's not just a piece of memory or a story that I choose to believe in, but that there's an actual rational position here, a logical position that can be defended.
I mean, it's almost like a process of elimination, saying if I have to choose, I mean, the possibility of a human being creating such a story and selling it and getting it believed by a nation is near to impossible. Again, not impossible, but very, very unlikely. It's a high improbability that a lie of that magnitude or a deception of that magnitude could be pulled off with such success.
Right.
I mean, the claim is a mass revelation claim, obviously, right? They would say that there was, say 3 million people who were at Matan Torah. And to get 3 million people in on a lie is very difficult. So Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't have made it up, because that would be very challenging to him, have him come down and say, hey guys, guess what? Here's what you just experienced. And they would say, no, we didn't experience that. That would be near impossible.
Right.
The most likely claim would be that it happened later on in history. That later on in history, at some point, somebody came along and kind of like, created some sort of religious story, or religious, I guess, birth story where this Jewish nation was formed in the past, and he's speaking to a nation who is currently not aware of it, or loosely aware of it, but they don't really have any text. They don't have the same body of laws or culture or experience, and that would also be quite challenging. In other words, to say, well, I mean, how come I never heard about this? I mean, the Torah tells me that every year I'm supposed to be having this Pesach story. Nobody ever told me this story before. We're supposed to be having, the Mishkan with all the korbanos. It's like, we haven't seen those ever. We're supposed to have kosher and Shabbos and Chagim, and nobody ever sat in a sukkah. Nobody ever had a lulav. We've never heard of any of these things. Who are you? Right? And he said, no, these are the laws that you've been practicing for the last 500 years. And here's your story. It's like, no, I don't know anything about that. Used to be slaves. Okay, maybe we were slaves. I don't know. Maybe that part of it could be true. But to have a book that would be backdated with history and law and culture that nobody knows about, it would be quite a shock to be able to pull that one off. In other words, and it would be a poor strategic move as well. In other words, nobody should go ahead, if you're trying to go ahead and, if your goal is to pull off a lie, you would never pull off a lie like that. Just say that you, like everybody else, you just had some sort of epiphany, God spoke to you, whatever it would be, you got some magical book from the sky and here it is, and you can go ahead and convince people. People can be convincing, but to convince people of their past and their culture is a little bit more challenging.
So this is what you would say somewhat of an abductive argument for God, in the sense that it's a probabilistic argument. The overwhelming probability is that God revealed himself on Sinai. And if I can paraphrase, that stands really on two legs, that argument. Number one, the text itself, the Torah itself, presumes that there was a mass revelation, right? Not a single person having a prophetic experience like you see, let's say, in Islam with Muhammad, or in Christianity with Jesus. But there's this mass revelation where, somewhere to the tune of 3 million people are observing an event, and you just can't convince 3 million people of a firsthand account that isn't actually true, that wasn't actually observed. And then the second piece of the argument, maybe equally important, and the one that I think we'll talk about, because I'll betray a little bit of my own thinking on this, is that then that story was consistently passed down generation to generation, and there just wasn't any room for that story to be reinvented later on. Because at some point, it's either part of the culture because it actually happened and it becomes embedded in the cultural stories of the Jewish people, or it's not there. And if someone tried to stand up and say, hey, this happened, everyone would be like, we've never heard that before, so that probably didn't happen. Is that a fair way to sort of summarize the argument?
Yeah, fair.
Okay, so I'll betray my own, since, I think that our personal positions here matter. I'm much more in the experience camp, and I find a rational proof for God, both as a first cause, but let's deal with what we're talking about, which is the experience at Har Sinai. I find that argument hard, and I find it hard on the second leg of the argument, on the tradition leg. And to me, it's Ezra that really challenges this for me, because by the Navi's own admission, the period where Ezra comes and sort of reteaches Torah to the Jewish people, it seems to be a period of mass ignorance, right? It seems to be a period of high assimilation. And Ezra really is a huge force in Jewish history at sort of reorienting the people toward their tradition. And so I think that we could point to Navi itself to potentially find a flaw in this argument, in that there seem to be periods where people had forgotten in a serious way what their tradition was.
I mean, I would agree that there's certainly this idea where there are some people who have forgotten. We have to understand the story. Ezra certainly is the minority of the nation in terms of what's going on there. Secondly, even within the story of Ezra, who are these people and why are they interested in building such a Beit HaMikdash or something like that? I mean, they definitely have a basic understanding of who they are, right? Even if they have like, a lapse in certain areas, they're not kind of like completely, nomads who know nothing and have no background, have no history, and have no religion, right? They are people who might have lapsed in their religion, right? There's like, there's people who are lacking knowledge, and there's people who are kind of like, within the religion. I mean, if that makes sense, it's not like to the point where they have become assimilated and lost every identity of who they are. They're clearly on a mission doing something, right? So I mean, I understand that certainly people can lose pieces, but I don't know, I mean, that they're going to lose everything. And certainly, again, with understanding with the Ezra story, definitely he's talking to a minority of the people in terms of what's going on there.
Right. So I think that's definitely a fair point to my mind, in that, we don't really have a sense of how broad Ezra's influence is. And presumably, he's not tweeting, so there's only a certain, subsection of the total Jewish people that he was able to address. But I would push back a little bit on the point about whether people could forget this. I mean, I always think of this in the sense of second generation Soviet Jews, right, who we're familiar with, who, for those who have gone to, summer camps in Russia and met many of the Jews who lived in the Soviet Union, many of whom immigrated to Israel, their knowledge of Jewish culture and Jewish history was significantly limited within one generation. And I guess the question is, could you explain to that group of people a story about Revelation that they would believe?
I think I could explain a story to those people about Revelation that they would believe. The problem is that we're not talking about that. We're talking about a nation that in theory had been living in the land. Again, the made up story has to happen sometime during the time of the Mishkan, time of the Beit Rishon. I mean, archaeological evidence of a Jewish people with the Beit HaMikdash, you can't compete there. It has to have been made up within that time period, right? And that's a time period where it's not where you have a whole bunch of people who are living an assimilated life in a different culture. It's a people who, in theory, according to whatever the person who's making a claim is, these are the people who came into the land with power and strength, who conquered the land, who have been leading a religious life officially since Matan Torah. There's been a Mishkan that's been functioning for hundreds of years, or however long it's being, right? This is not the same as the Soviet Jewry. Certainly you can get people and you can wipe their brains of all cultural memory. I mean, you can look at what happened, like in terms of like the indigenous people who have been oppressed. You can look at the situation in the Soviet Jewry. You can look at the slavery in America, where you can take people out of their cultures and make them forget everything, and then you can go ahead and teach them about their past, and I never knew that. But here you're talking to people you're saying, this is what you have been doing consistently for the last 500 years. It's not saying, oh, you've forgotten it. There's been no, it's not a comparable story, because the claim is that these people are continuing to do what they've been doing. There's no point where we say, oh, you've lost it all, and now I'm going to reintroduce something to you. The Ezra story notwithstanding, which is much later in history than what would be the seminal moment of this created religion, right? It wouldn't happen there. It would have to have happened.
Right. So you're saying essentially something was created beforehand, right, that also had the mass revelation story in it and was clearly there. So even if you go to Ezra and there's some forgetfulness on the part of the people, and Ezra's reteaching them the Torah, you still have to address that earlier period where this revelation story was clearly part of existence. Part of the Jewish people's cultural consciousness and their faith consciousness.
Correct. That's the idea.
Okay, great. So let's go back on one more point before we wrap up. Let's go back to that first cause argument. And why don't you articulate that in your own words? We kind of glossed over it, and I want to kind of make sure we have a real picture of your faith foundation. So we have the revelation argument, but as you point out, you still need to sort of establish that there is a God who created the world, right? And a God that is in control of the world might actually relate more to your second point, but let's for argument's sake say a God that created and has some influence over the world. So what does the first cause argument look like to you?
I mean, from my personal perspective, it's kind of like it's a blend of the first cause and argument of design. But I would say simply, again, first cause just gets me the idea that you can't have the infinite regress. You have to have something to start something. In other words, otherwise we don't get. I mean, the fact that we exist now demonstrates that something started it, right? And if I have a start, that means that there was nothing before it. So I either have an eternal universe or I have to have something starting it. But also the idea of just the experience in terms of argument of design, that, I mean, our natural tendencies, and again, that seems to be the idea, is that if I were to go ahead and experience life, whether it's the idea of cause, which is, again, maybe like according to Hume, there is no such thing as cause, and it's all, it's all based upon experience, and there really is no such argument that you can make. But based upon our experience, the way that we make decisions in our life, and that's the idea of being consistent, is based upon how I determine what is true in every other aspect of my life. If I were to apply that to existence and apply it to God, so then I would say, oh, there is a creator. I think that's also in terms of the argument of design. I mean, certainly you can go ahead and say, well, is it possible that, 1 in a whatever trillion chance? It's like, well, no, if it happened, it happened. Right now, what are you going to do? You're going to argue with statistics? And I say, you know what? When we make decisions based upon the fact that we don't experience that way. If we were to play a game of like, I don't know, whatever the random game of like, say heads or tails, and we started playing, and I kept on flipping, and I won 100 times in a row, you're going to call me a cheater. You're going to look for my two-headed coin, but I'm going to say, no, it's possible. And you're going to say, no, you're going to make a decision based upon the fact that you don't truly believe that that's going to happen. In other words, the way that you act in your life, I believe, has to be consistent. So if I act one way in all areas, but when it comes to religion, all of a sudden I'm going to say, no. For that, I demand it to be 100%, and it has to be perfect, and has to everything line up. At that point, I say, well, maybe we're being inconsistent, and there's a bias within me that's trying to push religion away, as opposed to being open to the possibility of its truth. And I think that's what I'm saying. In other words, I don't see it as a compelling proof that is going to push me. I just see it as a way of approaching life in a consistent way, the way that I approach everything else. And then I approach religion and say, okay, well, now will I act in a way that is consistent with the way I act in other areas?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask a question now that I don't think, hits at the core of your point, but I think is important to address when you talk about the teleological argument, right? Or the argument from design, and the analogy that I think by the time our students are listening to this podcast, they'll have learned this. But the watch, right, that you find on the beach, and there, what are the chances that watch randomly came together? There must be a designer for that watch, right?
Right. That's a terrible argument.
So that's not your argument from design.
I mean, it's a terrible argument. I mean, I'm a biology background.
Right. So now you're preempting my next question, which is not just about evolution, but about the concept of emergence in general, right? This idea that we see in our universe that very complex systems, right, including our economic system, can emerge from very simple actions, right? Now, I get that. I think when you extrapolate that out to the scale of the physical universe and to the elements that underpin the physical universe, it works from there, but it doesn't work proceeding there, mostly because it's beyond our understanding. But yeah, how do you respond to that idea of emergence as sort of a counter argument to the argument from design?
So I would generally, for that, I try to kind of like narrow down the level of complexity that we demand design for. So for example, like I think it was like the 2001 Space Odyssey. It was like this old movie where like they found like this like prism, or I didn't see the movie, but it's like you find like this block with like perfectly squared edges and polished stone sitting on the moon when they got there. It's like this like obelisk of some sort. They say, there must be aliens. It's like, I don't know, maybe the rock just showed up there. In other words, that level of design demand a designer. Or like if you're going ahead and you find an archaeologist, and the archaeologist finds this rock and they say, ooh, that's an axe. It's like, how do you know it's an axe? He says, based upon the way that it broke, you can see that somebody clearly chiseled away at that rock to create. It's like, isn't it possible that rocks break on their own? No. And here, this was a hunting site because you can see the arrowhead. I don't know, it just looks like a rock to me. It's like, no. It's an arrow that's perfectly, you can see the rock was perfectly split in that way. So I'm saying I prefer to go with that because it's a simpler thing as opposed to a gradual development where you need pieces to join together. I mean, if I take a simple thing like that and we demand designers for such a thing, so I'm saying, you know what, our threshold for design isn't so high. In other words, I don't need to put a complex watch together in order to claim a designer. I don't need to like, 1,000 monkeys typing for 1,000 years Shakespeare. They're not going to produce. I don't need something like that, because in all honesty, I think it's cheating the argument evolution. It's not really understanding how evolution works anyways. But when it comes to our demand for a designer, again, what our natural tendency is that when we see simple things, we also demand designers. It doesn't have to be extremely complex. Right. So therefore, that's what I would say in response.
But you're obviously not feeling that could just be an illusion or a desire, a sort of psychological character trait of ours to look for knowledge and complexity where there may not be some. Meaning, if someone saw an ant colony functioning together, right, and how they're worker ants and they're hunter ants, and then when a bunch of hunter ants get killed, the worker ants change their roles to become hunter ants. Would look at that and think there's complexity there, but in fact there really isn't any complexity. There's just a complex system that's evolved from simple elements, and we can be tricked into seeing complexity. So how would you respond to that in terms of the idea that maybe the argument from design is just our desire to see complexity where maybe there really isn't that much complexity at its core?
I didn't really quite understand the ant thing, and that like the ant is being designed by ants. In other words, it's not randomly happening. There is a conscious thing that's making it, whether it's based upon its natural evolutionary needs or whatever it would be. In other words,
but no one ant understands the system, right? No one ant has built the system to function in this way. Every ant just does the 2 or 3 programs it's able to do, and that in turn creates complexity.
Right, but it's still. I mean, everything is still intended. In other words, there's something that's trying to do something, whether it joins together or not. I mean, I would say to directly to your point. In other words, I don't particularly care whether that's what I naturally am predisposed to or not. But what my claim is that I'm saying if I'm naturally predisposed to that in every area of my life, so then I would say then, why is it that when in every area of my life I have that natural predisposition, but when it comes to God, all of a sudden I pull back and I don't follow my natural predisposition? It seems to be that that's the biased argument as opposed to the other way around. My idea is to live a consistent life, and whether I'm living in a delusional mind or not, if I'm being consistent with it, that's better. But if I notice that there's one point in my life that I'm inconsistent about, and that's religion, then I have to wonder if my religious decisions are in fact the problem.
Fascinating, because when you express it that way, I almost feel like you're coming closer to my point of view, which is that ultimately God is something you experience in your life, or you don't. But for me, it's something I've experienced in my life. God is an entity that I've turned to in genuine need in my life, and that I come down to, I can't discount that experience. I can ignore it. I can rationalize my way out of it. But it was a genuine and real and fundamentally real experience. And it's, certainly a result of my childhood, and it's certainly a result of, how I was raised, but that doesn't make it any less real or impactful for me, in the same way that other sort of intangible things like love and beauty and things like that, I also can't reduce to logical arguments. I think what's interesting is, even though you're coming at it from the perspective of design, you're also pointing out that at the end of the day, if this is the way I perceive it, then that has to be real. Even if I could come up with some other logical way of saying, well, it's not really as complex as you're seeing it, it doesn't matter because the complexity is still what I'm perceiving. Is that fair?
Right. Yes. You're talking about personal experience, and I'm talking about intellectual experience. In other words, intellectual consistency. But yes, in other words, there's definitely this idea of this is how I experience reality. This is how I understand things. This is how I relate to my experience as an existing being on this planet. And I need to be honest with myself. And I think honesty requires consistency.
Awesome. Rabbi Sonenberg, thanks so much for being our first guest on the Honors Philosophy Podcast.
A pleasure.